Thank you very much, especially to Paul and Tan for agreeing to do this. This is maybe I've explained briefly to Tan just now while waiting for the rest to come in. Maybe let me take this opportunity to maybe share a little bit especially with Paul as well, that we are from the National Higher Education Research Institute in Malaysia. With me here, many of them are colleagues who are not based in my university and in my institute, but they are related to the institute through what we have this associate research fellows, as well as we have this year we actually started 3 different research clusters, and one of them is looking at the issue of access and success in higher education. And within that itself, that there is an interest on the whole topic of employability. And because this year everything has become virtual, we got a little bit sick of those webinars where you have crowds come in and then everyone talk for an hour and a half and then we just go off. So we came up with something that before COVID, what actually as an institute we used to do is we used to have this chit-chat session where on a weekly or fortnightly basis, someone would just get together and talk about one topic, share with colleagues some of the work he or she is doing, a very informal kind of conversation. But because of COVID now, we can't even go back to our office. I'm currently at home. So what then we sort of thought about is we turn this into what we call a conversational, we call it the teh tarik. The teh tarik in Malay means the milk tea. The tea that you have in the UK, for example, here we actually mix with condensed milk and it becomes very milky. If you're familiar with the Asian version of tea, is usually very sweet, and so we always it's kind of a culture. We don't go to the pub where we go to what we call a mama store where we have this milk tea, and over that cup of tea we usually will talk a lot of things. So we kind of use that as this, we sort of theme it as the teh tarik conversation. So it's just a conversation on various topics, and this is the second teh tarik session we having on the topic on employability. We had one last week on the concept of education hub, and generally that discussion about that. I mean, if you are familiar with some of the work here, Malaysia has been very obsessed with this whole idea of an education hub. So we are revisiting that idea and getting scholars who have been working on the topic to share with us what are some of the latest developments and that direction. So same thing here today, we want to talk about the topic of employability. And I also know both of you have done a lot of work in this area. And then it's just a discussion on the topic itself, right? So what we will do is we will record. I will have a clear sort of starts where we will cut it off from there on. We will perhaps edit and clean up the recording. But before we actually post the recording on our website as well as on YouTube, what we're going to do is we're going to produce an issues paper based on our discussion today. All right. So one of my students here, Keng Hao, who is doing his master's with me on the topic of employability, actually. So he will be here to also pick up some points and work on that issues paper. And then we will circulate the issues paper to you for your feedback, and everyone here to also have the chance to have a look. Not only Paul and Tan, but a few other colleagues in the room. You can actually turn on the mic and speak as you go. So it's very casual, very informal. It's just that it's recorded, and the recording will then be released together with that issues paper that we're going to put it up on under the National Higher Education Research Institute. And what we usually do with our issues paper is they are actually sent to policymakers and all university leaders in the country. So even the Minister of Higher Education will have a copy on her desk on a monthly basis from any of the issues paper that we produce. All right. Any questions, any clarification before we start? And then so we will, once we get in, then that would be the part where we will trim it out and to post it on the website later.
No, all good for me.
No?
Yeah, all good for me too.
All right. Okay. Other colleagues, Jas, Doria, or Padin, anything to add? All right. Let me just double check. Okay, no, nothing. All right. So feel free to jump in, colleagues. And it's a very formal conversation, and we can do this. All right. All right. If everyone is fine, then I will officially start, and then I'll first maybe start with a very simple. Helps each one have a chance of Paul and also Tan to also share your ideas and the definition of what graduate employability is as we begin to unpack that concept. And then we will go into talking about some of the implications to the massification of higher education. I think that is related to that, and that whole notion of what is that? Is that the benchmark of success in higher education that we are all aiming at? And then to look at some of the issues related to that. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right. Good. All right. Then in that case, I will kickstart that. All right. Thank you very much for coming to the second Tarik session on graduate employability, organized by the National Higher Education Research Institute, IPPTN. As we all know, the Malaysian Education Blueprint, Higher Education 1 in 2015 to 2025, has defined graduate employability as the measure of quality of teaching in terms of its effectiveness in preparing students for the workforce who meet the needs of the economy. This idea of employability is then translated into the use of indicators to measure graduate employability, especially in the Malaysian higher education system, which is the destination of graduates from universities 6 months after their studies. Gradually, with that indicator, universities and each of the academic programs has been measured with this indicator of graduate employability. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about this whole concept of graduate employability. What I've just spoke about is the policy definition and including the operational definition of what graduate employability is within the Malaysian higher education context. But we also understand that this is not a very specific profile. This is a very important concept that we need to first unpack in terms of what we mean by graduate employability. And we have with us beside colleagues who are associated to the National Higher Education Research Institute. We also have Paul and also Tan with us here to discuss and unpack this whole topic of graduate employability. Maybe let me start by inviting Paul to share a little bit about your idea and the work that you've done. How would you see graduate employability?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess you can understand graduate employability in two different ways. You can either understand it as a process by which engagement with higher education in some ways changes students, and that changes them in ways that makes them more employable. So kind of you have employability as a process, and the second way of understanding employability, which kind of relates more strongly to your introduction, is employability as a measure of the quality of the quality of higher education. Now, employability as a process, for me, I don't think that's centrally what a university degree does. I think a university degree engages students with collective bodies of knowledge that change a student, but that process can make a student more employable, and you would expect it to. So I think there's an interesting conversation to have about how we bring ideas of knowledge and skills together to develop a knowledge-rich version of employability. In terms of employability as a measure of the quality of higher education, I think that's much more problematic. And particularly when you try and measure it in terms of whether students get a job or not, because we know that employment outcomes are far more strongly linked to students' backgrounds, to their level of privilege, than they are to the particular degree they study. So for me, there's an interesting conversation to have about employability as a process and how universities support that. But employability as a measure of quality, I think, is much more problematic.
Okay, we'll come back to that and to discuss it. I think so far we have actually two different concepts, or perhaps three. I think the policy context that I mentioned earlier may be slightly different to that whole notion of employability as a measurement of quality as well. Maybe Tan, you want to add on to that? Any of your work on employability, how would you unpack that a little bit more for us to discuss?
Yes, I totally agree with Paul. So, so when we talk about employability, we tend to think about employability as employment outcomes, and we tend to measure, after 4 months or 6 months of their graduations, and then we see how many, percentage get jobs or not. And then we use that percentage, to tell, the quality of universities or teaching and learning, whatever. So my work is more interested, more about the process, like Paul said. But my work is not about like during the process of students doing their studies. But I am more about the process after the students graduate, and then how they negotiate, so their employability. So for the last few years, my work's very much about, so I define employability as, a phenomenon that has at least, like 4 things. The first one is employment outcomes. The second one is job sustainability, because for me, so if students get a job and then they quickly, drop or change, or, change to something else, for me, it's not very healthy for students. And also it is not, something we can tell about good quality of teaching and learning. And also I define employability as something related to well-being of students as well, and job satisfaction, because, so for students to be employable, so they need to have, job satisfaction. If they do not engage what they are doing, they can quickly, so quit and change their job. Yeah, so for me, employability is very complicated. We can't, equate employability to employment. So that's, we need to make it clear. Yeah.
And I think adding on to that, really, I mean, what the 4 aspects that you mentioned, only one that is very visible, very short term, that you can actually measure, that is the employment outcome, right? How would you go on and elaborate on the other 3 concepts on that, and how would you relate that to university education?
Yeah, so for my work, I look into graduates after at least 5 years of their graduation, and I see it's like, so what kind of resources they need for their employability negotiation. So for my work, I use the terms employability negotiations a lot, because I think it's like the negotiation process that graduates need to go through. And through the process, I look at, after 6 months in Australia, so we measured employment outcomes, so normally it's after 6 months, and some places we use like after 1 year. And when I look at, the employment outcomes and the kind of resources that graduates need after 6 months, after 1 year, after 3 years, and after 5 years, and even after, longer than 5 years, the type of resources they need for their employability negotiations are very different. So after, like for example, after graduates within a year, a lot of graduates need to like engage with casual job and part-time work, because it is hard for fresh graduates to compete with experienced graduates, and especially in Australia, it's very competitive. It's not like in Japan, where they have some like government regulations to control the differences between, the labor market space for fresh graduates and experienced or seniors or graduates. But in Australia, it's just like free, to compete, with each other. So after, like within 1 year after their graduations, so I found a lot of graduates need to do casuals and do part-time and, jump, so from, job to job, and they have to do, engage with a lot of things that not really related to their disciplines. The reason was that they need to learn about the labor market. They need to articulate what I call cultural capital, because like their understanding about the labor market is very limited within 1 year after graduation. So after 1 year, when they enhance, my research is very much about capitals. I call it like social capital, cultural capital, and psychological capital. So after 1 year, I found, many graduates, they enhance their social capital, their cultural capital, and then they become more confident. So the rate of the employment outcomes for graduates after 1 year is significantly higher after 1 year. And then after 3 years, a number of graduates start changing their job because, a number of reasons. But, many graduates, they feel like they want to test something new. And after 5 years, yes, some graduates, again, they change their job the second time. So you can see, like, after at least three stages in my research, I found like different patterns. So that's why I say, if we measure, the employability based on short-term employment outcomes, it's very problematic. So what I have tried to do is I look at the type of resources that graduates need after short term and long term, and then I make the argument how university look at this type of resources, and then we embed in our teaching and learning for short term so that we can prepare our students for short term and long term. Yes, that's what I am very much about. Yeah.
Maybe Paul can add on to that. I think I've read your book and you have articulated that problematic notion that employability is a measurement of quality, right? Does that fit in with what Thanh has just shared with us, or you have additional points? So.
Yeah, no, definitely relates in. And it's that kind of sense of the employment outcomes of students are not under the control of universities. So if you're measuring the quality of something, you have to measure it in terms of something, you have to directly measure the quality of universities in terms of something universities can have a direct effect on. And they can't have a direct effect on employability because it's related to many other factors. So employability doesn't tell you about the quality of universities. It tells you, it might tell you a little bit about that, but it also tells you a great deal about the background of your students. It tells you a great deal about the structure of your economy. It tells you a great deal about social inequality and economic inequality in your particular society. It tells you all kinds of things, but it doesn't really tell you about the quality of your institution. The other thing I think that really relates to Than's work in my book is that doesn't mean that there aren't very important discussions to have about quality. And for me, my focus on quality for universities would be around how well designed is your curriculum to prepare students for an unknowable future. So when you say to students, come and study with us, this knowledge we have can do really exciting things for you. When we have that conversation with students and we tell them that it's worth them spending their time and in lots of cases their money studying with us, what do we think is going to happen to them? How do we think they're going to change? And what do we think they're going to be able to do in society because they've studied with us? And so for me, there is a responsibility to kind of draw on the work that Than's done and look at actually what do our graduates go on to do when they reach the labour market with the degree they've studied with us. How has that enabled them to do things they want to do? Also beyond employment, how has it allowed them to make an important contribution to society? And that, within the Malaysian higher education blueprint, that kind of contribution to society beyond employability is part of that blueprint. So I do think, you know, as educators, higher education has a responsibility to look at what their graduates do and think about how they can prepare them for the future. And that's about, you know, I'm convinced by the argument made by John Bowden and Ferenc Martin in a book, very old book now, called The University of Learning. And they say, what's the point of a university degree if much of what a student learns will be out of date, maybe when they graduate, maybe within 3 years, maybe within 5 years? And the answer they come up with is, it's about learning to see the world as a chemist, as a biologist, as an architect, as an artist. And it's that way of seeing the world that your university degree gives you and allows you to go out in the world and do interesting things. So powerful conversations about how we design our curricula to allow students to develop powerful ways of seeing that then allows them to do important things in the world. There, for me, that's the avenue where you have interesting conversations about the quality of an education. If you simply measure it in terms of employment outcomes, all you will get is that the more elite institutions do better because employers prefer to employ people from elite institutions. It's got nothing to do with quality. Doesn't mean elite institutions don't have quality. It's just that that measure of employability doesn't tell you anything about quality.